Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a history you probably never learned in school. We're going way, way back, before written records, before cities, before even those first little campfires were banked for the night. Imagine you're huddled inside a cave, the fire's dying down to embers, and outside, the world is a symphony of unknown sounds, a rustle in the trees, a distant howl. Each one could be nothing, or it could be a sign of a new, terrible spirit. And in this world, if someone you know starts acting strange, their eyes unfocused, their words a jumble, you don't call them mentally ill. You look at them and you see a vessel, a home for a ghost, a lost soul, a demon. Tonight, we'll see how humanity has understood, misunderstood, and tried to help the troubled mind. You probably won't survive this journey with your modern sensibilities intact, so prepare for some truly wild ideas. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments so we can all feel a little more connected. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You close your eyes and feel the damp stone of the cave wall against your back. A chilling draft whispers through the entrance. Your tribe, the one that hunts and gathers in this valley, has a problem. Old Man Kale, the one who tells the best stories by the fire, has been silent for weeks. He sits, staring at nothing, sometimes humming a low, tuneless melody, other times rocking back and forth. You watch him, a knot of fear in your stomach. What has happened to him? The shaman, the one with the bone necklace and the paint on her face, says Kyle's spirit has left his body. It's wandered off, perhaps to the land of the ancestors, perhaps captured by a mischievous trickster spirit. This is the first, most ancient interpretation of what we now call mental illness. It wasn't about broken brains or chemical imbalances, it was about the soul, the spirit, and its place in the world. Your shaman starts a rhythmic chant, pulling out dried herbs and animal bones, preparing a ritual to lure Kyle's spirit back, or to drive out whatever entity has taken its place. The earliest records, though they are sparse and require a lot of historical guesswork, suggest that our distant ancestors viewed strange behavior through this spiritual lens. They didn't see a defect in the person, they saw a spiritual event happening to the person. Mainstream historical fact: archaeological evidence from the Neolithic era, particularly the discovery of trepanned skulls with a small, circular hole drilled into them, suggests that early humans may have performed this crude surgery to release evil spirits or relieve pressure. It's a pretty horrifying idea. But to them, it might have been an act of desperate compassion. The belief was that the hole would give the malevolent force a way to escape. Can you imagine the sheer terror and hope tied up in that one tiny hole? A quirky tidbit is that some of these skulls show signs of bone regrowth, indicating the patient actually survived the procedure, which is amazing, and also a testament to human resilience. You watch as the shaman presses a poultice of crushed leaves to Kael's forehead, the smell of moss and earth filling the air. She whispers an incantation, her voice a low drone that sounds like the wind itself. What is she saying? What is the force she's trying to appease or command? You don't know, but you feel the weight of it, the ancient faith in unseen forces. Historians still argue whether these spiritual treatments were pure superstition or if they sometimes offered a form of primitive psychological support, using ritual and community to comfort the afflicted, perhaps the very act of the tribe gathering around, showing concern, and performing a familiar ritual was in itself a kind of group therapy. As you settle in for the night, the fire is now just a handful of glowing coals, and the rhythmic chanting of the shaman is the last thing you hear before you drift off. Wondering if Kael's spirit will find its way back home by morning, you are no longer in the cave, but in the sun-drenched valley of the Nile. The scent of papyrus and mud from the river hangs in the warm, dry air. A funeral procession winds its way toward the pyramids. But something feels off. You see a man being carried on a stretcher. His family mourns, not for a peaceful death, but for a mind that has wandered away. His soul, they believe, has been plagued by a malevolent force. In this world, the ancient Egyptians have a unique and startling view of the human body and spirit. They believe the heart, not the brain, is the seat of consciousness, emotion, and intellect. The heart, they say, holds the soul, the IB, and is the only organ weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the afterlife. The brain, they considered it a useless lump of goo, something to be discarded during the mummification process. You watch as the embalmers, with their long, delicate tools, prepare the body. They use a hooked instrument to pull the brain out through the nose, an almost casual act. They didn't even bother to preserve it, tossing it into a waste jar. It's a pretty mainstream historical fact that this was standard procedure, a testament to their belief in the heart's supremacy. This meant that any affliction of the mind was, to them, an affliction of the heart or soul. A person who was mentally unwell might be seen as having a weak or damaged IB. It was not a physical problem, but a spiritual one. Healing, then, would not involve the brain at all. It would focus on appeasing the gods or strengthening the soul. They'd use spells, prayers, and sometimes herbal remedies to cure someone of their mental distress. A quirky little tidbit is that they had specific prayers, called Book of the Dead spells, that were sometimes used to ward off demons thought to be responsible for mental afflictions. You can almost hear the soft, rhythmic recitation of the priests as they read from papyrus scrolls. You wander through the great temples, watching as a man, suffering from what we might now call anxiety, is brought before a priest of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess. This goddess, a terrifying but also healing deity, was believed to have a strong influence over health and disease. The man is not shackled or abused, he's treated with a kind of solemn reverence. He's suffering, and his suffering is a spiritual concern. The priest offers him a ritual drink and recites a long prayer, his voice a low hum against the massive stone columns. The aim is to calm the troubled spirit within the man's heart. It's a far cry from the modern concept of therapy, but it shows a foundational belief in the interconnectedness of the spiritual and mental world. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians' religious approach to mental health, with its focus on spiritual cures and rituals, was more effective or less effective than later, more medical approaches. Was the communal support and the power of belief itself a form of healing, or was it merely superstition? As you lean against a cool stone pillar, watching the dust motes dance in a shaft of light, you recall the story of the doctor and priest Sekhet-Ananch. He was a real person, a sort of physician to the royal court, and his tomb inscriptions show him as a healer of both the body and the mind. Though he would have seen those as one and the same, he wouldn't have been focused on a broken brain, but on a troubled soul. It's a different kind of empathy, a different kind of care, and it was all happening at a time when other civilizations were just figuring out how to build a mud brick wall. You can hear the gentle murmur of the temple, the soft shuffling of feet, and the far-off sound of the river, and you start to feel the same heavy calm that permeated this ancient world, a world where the heart was everything and the brain was just an afterthought. You're no longer in the fertile crescent of the Nile, but in the dusty, sun-baked plains of ancient Mesopotamia. The air smells of baked clay and market spices. You walk past ziggurats towering over the city of Babylon, and you feel the weight of a culture steeped in omens and divinations. Here, if someone you know starts to act erratically, if they see things that aren't there, or if they speak in a language no one understands, it's not because their heart is troubled, it's because a demon has taken hold. This is a pretty mainstream historical fact. The people of Mesopotamia, particularly the Babylonians and Assyrians, had a deep and intricate belief system that attributed mental and physical illness to supernatural causes. You stand by as a family brings their loved one, who has been suffering from what we might now call a psychotic episode, to a kind of priest-exorcist known as an ashipu. This man is not a doctor in the modern sense. He's a specialist in magical and spiritual medicine. He's a professional demon fighter. He inspects the afflicted person, not for physical symptoms, but for spiritual ones. He's looking for the telltale signs of a malevolent spirit, or galu. A quirky tidbit is that they had a whole taxonomy of these demons, each one with a specific name and a specific kind of affliction it caused. Some demons caused fevers, others caused blindness, and others still were responsible for madness. They were often believed to be angry spirits of the dead, or minor deities who had been offended. The Ashipu begins his work. He uses a series of incantations, prayers, and rituals to try and force the demon out. He might use a specific charm, or an amulet made of certain stones. He might also create a small statue of the demon and then destroy it in a symbolic act. The treatment is not for the person, it's for the spirit that's invading them. You hear the low, monotonous drone of the incantation, a litany of words meant to intimidate and banish the unseen force. A lot of these incantations were written on clay tablets, and many have survived, giving us a fascinating glimpse into a worldview that saw the universe as a dangerous place, filled with invisible entities just waiting to cause trouble. You can feel the tension in the air, the desperate hope of the family, and the quiet, focused power of the priest. Historians still argue whether the Mesopotamians' elaborate system of demonology was merely superstition or if it served a therapeutic purpose. The act of giving a name to the illness, this is a galu, this is a utuku, might have helped to make the unknown feel a little more manageable. It provided a framework for understanding and a method for treatment. Even if that treatment was purely spiritual, it was a way for a community to respond to something terrifying and inexplicable. Instead of blaming the person, they were blaming an external, invading force. This might have reduced some of the social stigma we associate with mental illness today, though it replaced it with the fear of being possessed. The family you're watching is not ashamed of their loved one, they are afraid for them. You can almost feel the dry wind carrying the dust of centuries across your face as you watch the ceremony unfold. The Ashipu places a small clay effigy on the ground and recites a final, forceful incantation. The family holds their breath, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and faith. In this world, the line between medicine and magic is completely blurred. To heal the mind, you must first heal the spirit. And that means going to war with the unseen forces that live just on the edge of your perception. You watch as the man on the ground slowly begins to calm, whether from the power of the ritual or from simple exhaustion. Either way, for a moment, the demon seems to have been subdued. The scene shifts again, and you're now standing in the city-state of ancient Greece. The air is warm and a light breeze carries the scent of olive trees and the distant sea. Instead of towering ziggurats or great pyramids, you're surrounded by graceful columns and public spaces bustling with philosophers and citizens debating everything from politics to the nature of the soul. Here, a new idea is taking hold, one that begins to move away from supernatural explanations. A man named Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, is at the forefront of this shift. He's proposing a radical theory: disease, including what we would now call mental illness, is caused not by demons or angry gods, but by natural forces within the body itself. You stand in a quiet courtyard as Hippocrates examines a patient who suffers from fits of what we'd now call mania, followed by periods of deep sadness. He doesn't chant or pray. Instead, he observes the patient, asking questions about their diet, their sleep, and their habits. He believes the body is composed of 4 essential fluids, or humours: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. According to this mainstream historical fact, the balance of these humours was the key to health. An imbalance meant illness. Too much black bile, he might say, causes melancholia, a state of deep sadness and contemplation. Too much yellow bile could lead to a fiery, angry disposition. The concept is beautifully simple, and it provides a logical, non-spiritual framework for understanding the mind and body. The treatments were often aimed at restoring this balance. You might be prescribed a specific diet, or perhaps a period of exercise to get things moving. A physician might recommend a change in climate, a cleansing bath, or even a purge to rid the body of excess humours. A quirky tidbit is that the colour of your phlegm or the consistency of your stool was a vital diagnostic tool. They'd study it, much like a modern doctor studies a blood test, to determine which humour was out of whack. The diagnosis was almost an art form, a sensory experience. As you listen to the low murmur of the diagnosis, you realize this is a revolutionary moment. For the first time, people are considering that the cause of madness might be physical, not spiritual. This idea of the humours would dominate Western medical thought for more than 2,000 years. Historians still argue whether the Hippocratic theory of humours, for all its scientific inaccuracy, was a net positive. Did it lay the groundwork for a more rational, medical approach to mental illness, or did its rigid adherence to a flawed premise blind physicians to other, more accurate explanations for centuries? You can almost hear the soft, steady rhythm of a lecture, a quiet moment of calm in a world that was just beginning to explore the complexities of the human mind. The Greeks, with their love of reason and order, sought to categorize even the most chaotic and irrational parts of the human experience. You watch as the patient is led away, not to a temple for an exorcism, but to a quiet room where a special diet will be prepared. The treatment feels gentle and human, a kind of holistic care that sees the person as a whole, from their digestive system to their temperament. The focus is on finding harmony within the individual, a microcosm of the Greek ideal of balance and order in the universe. It's a profound shift in thinking, and you can feel the ripple of it spreading across the Western world, slowly but surely, changing the conversation around mental health forever. From the sun-drenched courtyards of Athens, you are transported to the bustling heart of the Roman Empire. The air is filled with the scent of roasted meat, the clang of hammers, and the low roar of a chariot race in the distance. Here, the practical, pragmatic Romans took the Greek ideas about humours and balance and integrated them into their own society, but they also introduced a new, more institutional approach to mental affliction. You see a grand home, a villa with marble floors and lush gardens. Inside, a wealthy Roman matron, known for her sharp wit and powerful family connections, has fallen into a state of deep despondency. She weeps uncontrollably and refuses to eat. Her family does not immediately seek out a priest or an exorcist. Instead, they call for a physician, a follower of the Hippocratic school. He believes her melancholia is caused by an excess of black bile. His prescription is not a spiritual one, but a very practical one, a change of scenery. She is to be taken to a country estate, a place of quiet contemplation and clean air, away from the stresses of city life. This is a crucial, mainstream historical fact for the wealthy. Mental health care often meant private, domestic care, sometimes in a specially built sanctuary within a family's home. These places, sometimes called temples of Aesculapius, the god of healing, weren't just places of worship. They were also a kind of early, temple-based sanatorium, offering a peaceful environment, healing rituals, and a sense of calm. You can almost feel the smooth stone of a temple bench as you sit, listening to the soft murmur of prayers. The Romans understood that a tranquil environment could be part of the healing process. However, for those who were not wealthy, the situation was very different. You see a man, thin and disheveled, who wanders the streets, shouting incoherently at passers-by. He's not taken to a temple or a private villa. He's often tolerated, sometimes mocked, and sometimes becomes a public spectacle. A quirky tidbit is that while there were no dedicated public asylums in the Roman Empire in the modern sense, the mad were often housed in temple precincts or became a kind of tolerated part of the public landscape. Sometimes they were even seen as touched by the gods, not in a good way, but in a way that set them apart. It's a cruel kind of celebrity, where your suffering is a source of public entertainment or a point of morbid curiosity. Historians still argue whether the Romans' practical, institutional approach to mental health was a step forward or a step back. On one hand, it moved away from the purely spiritual and focused on a kind of environmental therapy. On the other hand, it codified a class-based system of care where the wealthy could afford a private, dignified form of treatment while the poor were left to fend for themselves in the streets. Was this a step toward the modern asylum, or was it a form of neglect disguised as tolerance? You watch as the disheveled man is given a piece of bread by a sympathetic baker. It's a moment of small kindness in a world that has no formal safety net for the mentally afflicted. The vast, bustling Roman Empire, for all its engineering marvels and legal systems, had no legal or social framework to protect the minds of its most vulnerable citizens. You can almost feel the cool shadow of a great aqueduct as you contemplate this contradiction. The Romans were masters of the physical world, but they were still struggling to understand the unseen, internal worlds of the mind. The grand Roman structures begin to crumble around you, and the bustling city gives way to a quieter, more solemn landscape. You find yourself in early Christian Europe. The echoes of gladiatorial combat are replaced by the soft tolling of a church bell. The focus on the body, so central to the Greeks and Romans, now takes a backseat to the soul with the rise of Christianity. The old theories about humours and bodily imbalances don't disappear entirely, but they are viewed through a new lens, the divine and the demonic. This is a mainstream historical fact. The prevailing belief in early Christian society was that mental distress was often a spiritual issue, a direct result of demonic possession, sin, or a test from God. You watch as a young woman, plagued by terrible visions and fits of screaming, is brought to a priest, not a doctor. The family is not ashamed, they are terrified. They believe a demon, or an angry spirit, has taken residence within her. The priest does not ask about her diet or her humours, he asks about her faith, her moral conduct, and her relationship with God. The diagnosis isn't melancholia or mania, it's a spiritual sickness, a sign of a soul in peril. Her treatment is a ritual of faith, prayer, fasting, and, most dramatically, exorcism. The priest holds a crucifix, and his voice is a low, steady chant as he commands the evil spirit to leave the woman's body. The air in the small room feels thick with tension and incense. A quirky tidbit is that exorcism rituals often involved specific prayers and the use of holy water, and the priest would often engage in a kind of theological dialogue with the supposed demon to learn its name and its purpose. It was a form of spiritual combat, with the afflicted person's soul as the prize. You can almost feel the cold dread of the woman as she thrashes, her voice not her own. The belief was that the demon was not part of her, but an external, invading force that could be driven out through the power of God. This view was both terrifying and, in a way, comforting. It absolved the person of any fault and placed the blame on an outside enemy. Historians still argue whether the Church's emphasis on demonic possession and sin was a step back for mental health treatment, while it provided a clear framework for understanding and a form of community support. It also led to severe and often brutal treatments, including physical restraint and prolonged prayer. It could also lead to social ostracization if the exorcism was unsuccessful, leaving the person labelled as unclean or unredeemable. Was this a necessary step for a society struggling to understand the mind, or did it pave the way for centuries of fear and persecution? You can almost smell the musty scent of the chapel, the flicker of the candle flames casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls, as the priest's voice rises and falls. In this era, the journey to mental wellness was not through a physical cure, but a spiritual one, a journey that might lead to salvation or damnation. The sombre grey of early Christian Europe fades, and you are bathed in the warm, golden light of the Islamic Golden Age. The air is vibrant with the scent of spices, the sound of merchants bartering, and the murmur of scholars debating in a great library. You find yourself in Baghdad, at the House of Wisdom, a centre of learning and a place where a new, revolutionary idea is taking hold. This is a mainstream historical fact. During the 9th to 12th centuries, the Islamic world created the first dedicated psychiatric hospitals, or bimaristans, and developed a compassionate, holistic approach to mental health care. You see a woman, once a respected teacher, now plagued by deep depression and fits of mania. She isn't taken to a priest for an exorcism, she is taken to a bimaristan, a hospital that treats both physical and mental ailments under one roof. She's not shackled or abused. Instead, she is greeted with kindness and dignity. The physicians here, influenced by Greek medical texts they translated and expanded upon, believe that mental illness has both physical and psychological causes. They still acknowledge spiritual factors, but they are not the primary cause. They believe the mind can be healed just like the body. A quirky tidbit is that these hospitals used a variety of groundbreaking treatments that we would recognize today as a form of therapy. They used talk therapy, art, music, and even aromatherapy. They believed that a person's environment could have a profound effect on their mental state. You can almost feel the cool tiles beneath your feet as you walk through a serene garden within the hospital walls, the sound of a lute playing a soft melody in the distance. The physicians, like the great scholar Rhazes, observed their patients meticulously, creating detailed case notes that are still being studied today. Rhazes, for example, wrote extensively on the importance of human dignity in treatment, advocating for compassion and understanding. Historians still argue whether the Islamic world's approach to mental health, with its focus on dedicated hospitals and compassionate care, was a true golden age for psychiatry. Was this a unique period of enlightenment that was lost in the West for centuries? Or were these institutions still limited in their understanding, with treatment often consisting of little more than humane custody? You watch a physician, with a quiet and respectful demeanor, sit with the woman and talk to her, asking not about her sins, but about her feelings. It is a profound and moving moment, a bridge between the superstition of the past and the science of the future. The Islamic world, through its preservation and expansion of ancient knowledge, offered a radical alternative to the demonic explanations of Europe. They offered hope, not fear, and they saw the troubled mind as something to be healed, not something to be feared or exorcised. It was a brief, but brilliant, flicker of light that would eventually find its way back to the west. The golden light of Baghdad fades, and the world grows colder, darker. You are back in Europe. In the high Middle Ages, the towering cathedrals and walled cities speak of a new kind of social order, one deeply influenced by the Church. While the Islamic world was advancing psychiatric care, Europe was taking a different path. The old Hippocratic ideas about humours still existed, they never truly went away, but they were now filtered through a Christian theological lens. This is a mainstream historical fact. The prevailing view of mental illness in medieval Europe was that it was often a form of melancholia, a spiritual and physical ailment caused by an imbalance of the black bile humour, but also deeply tied to an individual's spiritual state. You're in a monastery garden, the scent of damp earth and herbs filling the cool, misty air. You see a man, a scholar, who has fallen into a state of deep despondency. He's withdrawn, quiet, and seems to carry a great weight on his shoulders. He believes his condition is not just a physical one, but a spiritual one, a kind of acedia, or spiritual sloth. He feels a profound sense of despair, a feeling that God has abandoned him. This is the great paradox of the medieval mind. The body's humours were believed to be out of whack, but the ultimate cause was seen as a moral or spiritual failing. You could have a physical cause for your sadness, but the sadness itself was a sign of a soul in need of salvation. A quirky tidbit is that the colour black, associated with black bile, was seen as a powerful symbol of this condition. Melancholics were often depicted in art and literature as figures draped in dark robes, their faces cast in shadow. This colour symbolism became a kind of shorthand for the condition, a visual representation of their inner turmoil. You can almost feel the weight of this symbolic colour, the way it seems to press down on the man as he walks slowly through the garden, his head bowed. His treatment is a mix of the physical and the spiritual. A physician might prescribe a change in diet to balance the humours, but a priest or a monk would also prescribe prayer, contemplation, and moral instruction to lift his spirit from despair. Historians still argue whether the medieval concept of melancholia, with its blend of physical and spiritual explanations, was a more compassionate or more dangerous way of understanding mental illness. On one hand, it allowed for the idea that someone's sadness was not their fault, that it was a physical ailment. On the other hand, it also opened the door for moral judgment, for the idea that a person's lack of faith was part of the problem. Was this a genuine attempt to understand a complex human condition? Or was it a convenient way to place responsibility on the afflicted? You watch as the monk offers the man a cup of herbal tea, his face filled with genuine concern. The silence of the garden, broken only by the chirping of a few birds, seems to hold all the unanswered questions of a time caught between ancient science and fervent faith. The monastery garden fades, and you are now in a bustling medieval city. The air is thick with the smells of wood smoke and a kind of earthy, human odour that only crowded places seem to have. A doctor, dressed in a simple, dark tunic, stands over a patient. The patient, a merchant who has become listless and withdrawn, is suffering from what the doctor diagnoses as an imbalance of the humours. Remember those from the Greek era. They didn't go away, they just got a medieval makeover. This is a pretty mainstream historical fact. The theory of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, remained the dominant medical paradigm for centuries, and it was the primary lens through which mental health was understood. You watch as the doctor, with a quiet and serious expression, takes a small knife and makes a shallow cut on the merchant's arm. A few drops of blood well up and are quickly wiped away. This is bloodletting, a common practice aimed at rebalancing an excess of one humor. A quirky tidbit is that the specific vein or part of the body chosen for the cut was determined by complex astrological charts and the type of humor believed to be in excess. So, you didn't just get a cut, you got a custom, cosmically aligned cut. In this case, the doctor believes the merchant has too much melancholic black bile, and the bloodletting is meant to draw out some of the imbalance. The doctor also recommends a series of other treatments. He prescribes a specific diet, perhaps one that is warm and dry to counteract the cold and wet nature of black bile. He might also recommend a change in environment, a trip to the countryside to breathe in fresh air. You can almost feel the chill of the morning air on your face as you imagine the merchant setting off on his journey, his mind hopefully being rebalanced with every step. The belief was that the body and the environment were in constant conversation, and by changing one, you could change the other. This period was a strange mix of the mundane and the metaphysical. While a doctor might be focused on the physical body, a priest or a family member might be focused on the spiritual well-being of the patient. The body and soul were seen as two parts of the same whole, and an illness in one was a sign of a problem in the other. Historians still argue whether these treatments, like bloodletting and purging, were actually helpful or if they often did more harm than good. While they were based on a flawed understanding of the human body, the very act of a doctor taking a physical action and a community showing concern might have had a placebo effect, offering a kind of hope and attention that the patient desperately needed. It was a tangible way to fight an invisible enemy. The doctor, in this sense, was both a healer and a symbol of hope. You watch as the doctor packs his bag and moves on to his next patient, leaving the merchant to his recovery. A man treated not as a spiritual failure, but as a person with a physical imbalance that could, hopefully, be set right. The medieval city fades, and you are now in a quiet, shadowy clearing on the edge of a forest. The air is cool and still, and the only sound is the rustling of leaves and the faint whisper of a stream. A woman, a simple villager, is on her knees, her hands tied behind her back. Her eyes are wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. She isn't sick, not in the way a medieval doctor would understand it. Her village priest has declared her to be a witch. This is a crucial, mainstream historical fact. As the church's influence grew in the later Middle Ages, a deep and terrifying link was forged between bizarre behavior, mental distress, and the accusation of witchcraft or heresy. You watch as the priest, his face grim, recites a prayer. The village onlookers stand a safe distance away. Their face is a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine terror. The woman has been talking to herself, telling stories of a creature in the woods that speaks to her, and sometimes she falls into strange, catatonic states. Today, we might diagnose her with a psychotic disorder, but in this world, her behavior is clear evidence of a pact with the devil. Her strange words are the devil's words. Her fit's a sign of a demonic presence. A quirky tidbit is that the specific behaviors that were seen as signs of witchcraft were incredibly varied, from talking to yourself and having visions to having a birthmark in a strange place, or even just being a little too knowledgeable about herbs. A simple herbalist could, with one wrong look, become a sorceress. The priest holds up a holy symbol, and the woman flinches. This is seen as further proof of her demonic possession. There is no talk of humours, no mention of spiritual despair. This is a simple binary, good or evil, God or the devil. The treatment is not one of healing, but one of punishment and purification. The woman is not seen as a victim of her own mind, but as a willing participant in her own damnation. This is where the old ideas of demonic possession, which were sometimes framed with a kind of therapeutic goal, remember the exorcisms, take a much darker turn. The afflicted person is no longer just a vessel for an evil spirit, they are an evil person. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in witchcraft was a deliberate tool of social control or a genuine reflection of a society grappling with forces it could not understand. Was it a convenient way to get rid of societal outsiders and nonconformists, or was it a genuine, albeit terrifying, attempt to explain the unexplainable, to give a name to behaviors that were otherwise incomprehensible? You watch as the woman is led away, not to a hospital, but to a trial, a place where a rational mind and a troubled one would have no defense. The flicker of the firelight catches in her terrified eyes, and you feel the true horror of a time when the mind's darkest corners were seen not as a place for healing, but as a battleground for a war between heaven and hell. You turn from the dark woods, and the oppressive fear of the witch hunt gives way to a long, dusty road. You are a pilgrim, and you are not travelling for salvation alone, but for a cure for a troubled mind. Your cousin, a young woman who has become prone to strange visions and long periods of despondency, is travelling with you. You've been told that a pilgrimage to the shrine of a saint is her only hope. This is a mainstream historical fact. Pilgrimages to sacred sites were a common and highly valued form of treatment for both physical and mental ailments in the Middle Ages. You trudge along the road, the rhythmic sound of your footsteps on the dirt, a kind of hypnotic rhythm. The journey itself is an act of penance and faith. It's a physical manifestation of a spiritual struggle. You and your cousin are headed to a shrine dedicated to a saint known for healing the mad or possessed. The belief is that the saint, through divine intercession, can cast out the demons or heal the spiritual sickness that plagues the mind. A quirky tidbit is that some of these shrines even had specific rituals designed for the mentally ill, like being left alone in the church overnight, a practice known as incubation, with the hope that the saint would visit them in a dream and cure them. The journey is long and hard, but it's also a form of what we might now call group therapy. You are with others who are also seeking a cure, sharing stories of your suffering and your hopes. The shared hardship and the common goal create a sense of community that can be a powerful antidote to the isolation of mental illness. You can almost feel the dusty breeze on your face as you pass other pilgrims, a shared sense of purpose on every face. Historians still argue whether these spiritual journeys were effective. Was it the divine power of the saint that provided the cure, or was it the psychological impact of the journey itself? The act of walking, of leaving behind a stressful environment, the sense of hope, the communal support, all of these could have provided a powerful placebo effect or a genuine psychological relief. Perhaps the mind, in its deepest despair, was so open to the idea of a cure that it created one for itself. You finally arrive at the shrine, a simple stone church with a steeple that scrapes the sky. Inside, the air is filled with the scent of old wood and beeswax. Your cousin kneels before the statue of the saint, her hands clasped, her face a mask of weary hope. You feel a sense of peace settle over you. A quiet moment of calm in a loud and confusing world. A time when the path to healing was often a literal, physical one. The long road of the pilgrimage fades, and you are led down a quieter, more secluded path. The air grows cool and smells of old books and beeswax. The silence is profound, broken only by the soft chanting of monks. You are standing outside a monastery, a place of spiritual retreat and a surprising sanctuary for the troubled mind. This is a mainstream historical fact. For many in the Middle Ages, the monastery was a haven, and the contemplative, disciplined life offered a form of treatment for mental and spiritual afflictions. Your cousin, the same one from the pilgrimage, has been taken here, not for a quick cure, but for a long, quiet rest. The abbot believes her visions are a form of spiritual crisis, and that her despondency is a sign of a soul lost in the world. He believes the cure is not in a magic spell or a potion, but in a life of simplicity and devotion. You watch as a monk, his face kind and serene, leads her to a small, spare room. The treatment is a life of routine, prayer at dawn, work in the gardens, quiet study in the library. A quirky tidbit is that the very structure of the monastic day, with its fixed schedule and clear purpose, was believed to create a kind of mental order out of chaos. It was an external structure that could, hopefully, help to organize a chaotic internal world. You can almost feel the smooth, cool stone of the cloister beneath your fingertips as you walk, the sense of peace that permeates the air. There are no dramatic exorcisms here, no leeches or poultices. The healing is slow and subtle. It is the healing of a quiet life, of a community of support. The monks are trained to be compassionate and to listen, and the very act of confession, which was a regular part of monastic life, was a form of talk therapy, a way to unburden the soul of its secret worries and fears. Historians still argue whether the monastic life was truly a form of therapy or simply a form of social containment. Was it a compassionate way to deal with the mentally ill, offering them a safe place and a sense of purpose? Or was it a way for society to remove undesirables from the public eye and place them in a religious institution where their behavior could be controlled? You watch as your cousin, in her simple, dark robes, kneels to tend to a small patch of herbs in the garden, a small, fragile sense of peace on her face. The quiet life, with its focus on inner reflection and outer routine, offers a stark contrast to the chaos of the outside world. It suggests that sometimes, the best way to heal a troubled mind is to simply give it a quiet place to rest. The quiet of the monastery is shattered, and you find yourself in the noisy, chaotic center of a medieval town square. The air smells of livestock and unwashed bodies, and the sound is a cacophony of merchants hawking their wares, children playing, and the constant hum of a bustling crowd. Your eye is drawn to a man at the center of it all. He's wearing mismatched, brightly colored clothes, his hat has a long bell on it, and he's telling nonsensical jokes and performing clumsy flips. He's the village fool, or jester. This is a mainstream historical fact in medieval society. The fool was not just an entertainer, but a figure of accepted eccentricity, and their role offers a fascinating glimpse into how a society dealt with unusual behavior. You watch as he points a crooked finger at a haughty knight and speaks a truth no one else would dare to utter. He's a social commentator, a kind of court-approved wise man who can say and do things that would get anyone else locked up or worse. A quirky tidbit is that in some courts, a jester wasn't just a clown, they were a form of psychological safety valve. Their role was to release social tension through humor, to make fun of the powerful without consequence. Their madness, or their pretense of it, was their shield. It was a kind of accepted deviance, a license to be different. You see a group of children laughing at the fool, but a few adults watch him with a kind of solemn respect. He is a part of the community, a fixture, a living embodiment of the idea that not all strange behavior is a sign of evil or spiritual sickness. Some of it is just part of life. He's not shackled. He's not an outcast. He is, in his own way, a vital part of the social fabric. Historians still argue whether the role of the fool was a sign of a more tolerant society or a cynical way of managing a population. Was it a compassionate way to deal with the mentally different, giving them a role and a place? Or was it a way to exploit and make a spectacle of them for entertainment? You watch as the fool, his jokes finished for the moment, sits on a bench and eats a piece of bread, a quiet, almost sad look in his eyes. The laughter around him fades, and you feel the true complexity of this human archetype. He is a mirror, reflecting a society that was both terrified of madness and, in its own strange way, made a place for it. The laughter of the village fool echoes and fades, and you are now in a quiet, dark hut, the air thick with the scent of dried herbs. A woman sits on a stool, her face lined with age and wisdom. She's not a physician, not a priest, but she is the local healer. Her grandson, a young man who has been plagued by night terrors and fits of screaming, is lying on a straw bed. His family, unable to afford a physician or a long pilgrimage, has come to her. This is a mainstream historical fact. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, mental and physical ailments were treated with folk remedies and charms, passed down through generations. You watch as the healer takes a small leather pouch from her belt. She empties its contents onto a worn wooden table, a dried sprig of St. John's wort, a small, smooth stone, a piece of bone, and a handful of lavender. Each item has a purpose, a magical and medicinal property. She begins to crush the herbs with a mortar and pestle, her movements slow and deliberate. A quirky tidbit is that the act of creating the charm or remedy was as important as the ingredients themselves. She might whisper a prayer or a charm over the concoction, infusing it with power and intention. She believes the night terrors are caused by a mischievous spirit, and the herbs and stones are meant to ward it off. The St. John's wort, for example, was believed to be a powerful protection against evil spirits, and its golden flowers were said to hold the light of the sun. You can almost feel the smooth, cool stone as she places it on the young man's forehead, the act of a kind and caring ritual. Her treatments are a mix of what we would call herbal medicine and what we would call superstition. They are based on a deep, experiential knowledge of the natural world, but also on a belief in unseen forces. Historians still argue whether these folk remedies, many of which had no known medicinal properties for mental health, had any real effect? Was the cure in the herbs, or was it in the ritual, the care, and the belief of the family and the healer, the very act of doing something, of taking action against a terrifying and inexplicable problem, could have provided a profound sense of hope and comfort. It was a form of self-care and community care that existed outside of the formal institutions of the church and the medical establishment. You watch as the healer brews a calming tea from the lavender and gives it to the young man. The warmth of the cup in his hands and the gentle smell of the tea seem to calm him, if only for a moment. In a world with no formal mental health care, these small, human acts of care and compassion were sometimes the only hope. The dark hut and the gentle herbalist fade away, and you find yourself in the hushed, cavernous hall of a medieval castle library. The scent of vellum and old leather hangs in the cool, still air. A scholar, a man with a quill and ink-stained fingers, is poring over an illuminated manuscript. He's not a physician, but a theologian and philosopher, and he's reading about a topic that seems both academic and deeply personal, the connection between the body and the soul. This is a mainstream historical fact. The medieval worldview was a profoundly dualistic one, where the body and soul were seen as two separate, yet inextricably linked entities. An illness in one was believed to be a reflection of an illness in the other. You watch as the scholar traces a finger along a Latin text that describes the soul as the form of the body, the thing that gives it life and purpose. A quirky tidbit is that this belief led to some pretty interesting conclusions. For example, some theologians believed that a person's physical ailments were a sign of a spiritual flaw, a kind of visible representation of an invisible sin. It wasn't about punishment so much as a kind of cosmic communication. A weak body could mean a weak will. A troubled mind could mean a troubled spirit. You can almost feel the weight of this idea, the way it placed a profound moral and spiritual significance on every twitch and ache of the human body. The scholar closes the book and looks up, lost in thought. He's wrestling with the very real implications of this philosophy. If the body and soul are so connected, how do you treat an ailment of the mind? Do you focus on the physical humours, as the physicians do, or do you focus on the spiritual state, as the priests do? The answer, for most of the medieval world, was both. You would use a poultice and a prayer. You would seek a physician and a confessor. The two were not seen as separate, but as two sides of the same coin, each working to restore harmony to a person's entire being. Historians still argue whether this dualistic view of the body and soul was a beneficial one for mental health. On one hand, it allowed for a holistic approach to healing, where the patient was seen as a whole person, not just a collection of symptoms. On the other hand, it also placed a heavy burden on the individual, suggesting that their mental distress was a sign of a spiritual failing, which could lead to guilt and shame. Was this a compassionate way to see the human condition, or was it a theological trap? You watch as the scholar dips his quill in the inkwell, a small, black drop of ink falling onto the page, a perfect, physical representation of a great, invisible thought. In this world, the mind was not just a brain, it was a soul, and its health was a matter of life and death, both earthly and eternal. The quiet library and the solemn scholar vanish, and you are now in a field on a cool, clear night. You lie on your back, the grass a soft bed beneath you, and stare up at the vast, star-strewn sky. A man, a village elder, sits beside you, pointing out the constellations. He's not a physician or a priest, but he is a kind of astrologer, a man who believes that the positions of the stars and planets have a profound influence on a person's temperament and fate. This is a mainstream historical fact. Astrology was not just a fortune-telling tool in the Middle Ages, it was a serious scholarly pursuit and a key part of medical and psychological diagnosis. You watch as the elder traces the path of a planet across the sky with a gnarled finger. He explains that you were born under a certain alignment, and that alignment has given you a specific balance of the humours. A quirky tidbit is that each planet was believed to be associated with a specific humour. Saturn, for example, with its slow, heavy orbit, was associated with melancholic black bile. If you were born under a strong Saturn, you were more likely to be prone to sadness and contemplation. The position of the moon, too, was seen as a powerful influence, leading to the word lunacy, a term for madness that literally means moonstruck. You can almost feel the pull of the moon, the way it seems to hold a kind of power over the earth and, by extension, your mind. The elder is explaining that a person's mental state can be predicted and explained by their natal chart, the cosmic map of the sky at the moment of their birth. He believes that by studying the movements of the planets, a physician can predict when a person might be susceptible to an imbalance of the humors and prescribe a preventative treatment. He's not just telling a person's fortune, he's giving them a kind of cosmic diagnosis. Historians still argue whether the integration of astrology into medicine was a scientific dead end or a way for people to find meaning and order in a chaotic world. Did it provide a framework for understanding human behavior that was more comforting than the idea of random chance or demonic possession? Or did its rigid, deterministic nature prevent people from seeking more effective terrestrial treatments? You lie there, gazing at the glittering spectacle above, a sense of profound wonder and fatalism settling over you. In this world, the key to understanding your own mind wasn't found in your body or your soul, but in the distant, beautiful, and utterly unknowable movements of the heavens. The celestial map of the night sky dissolves into a grim, flickering interior. You're no longer with a kind, mystical elder, but in a room filled with shadows cast by a low-burning fire. Before you lies a heavy, leather-bound book, its pages filled with dense, terrifying Latin text and woodcut illustrations of horned devils and tortured souls. The book is the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, and its existence marks a terrifying turn in the history of mental health. This is a mainstream historical fact, published in 1487. This book was a detailed guide for witch hunters, and it explicitly conflated what we would now recognize as mental illness with the work of the devil. You can almost feel the cold dread as you read its pages. It's not just a book of theology, it's a legal and procedural manual, outlining how to identify, question, and torture a person accused of witchcraft. It presents a chilling worldview where every odd behavior, every strange fit, every muttered word is seen as a sign of a demonic pact. A quirky tidbit is that the book even had a kind of twisted diagnostic chart. For example, if a person confessed under torture, it was proof of their guilt. If they didn't, it was proof of the devil giving them strength to resist, which was also proof of their guilt. It was a no-win scenario, a perfect logical trap. You see a woman, frail and terrified, brought before a tribunal. She's been speaking in a strange voice, and sometimes she falls into a trance-like state. A few years ago, this might have been seen as a melancholic imbalance, or a spiritual test. Now, with the Malleus Maleficarum as the guide, it's irrefutable proof of a pact with Satan. She isn't a patient, she's an enemy of the faith. The treatment isn't one of healing, but one of punishment. The belief in a physical cause for her symptoms, which had existed for centuries, is almost completely erased by this new, terrifying theological framework. Historians still argue whether the Malleus Maleficarum and the witch hunts it fueled were a genuine attempt to combat evil or a convenient way for a society to deal with social outsiders, particularly women, who didn't conform to the norms. Was it a reflection of a society's deep-seated fear of the unknown, or a brutal tool of social control? You watch as the woman is led away, her eyes wide with a fear that is not a symptom, but a very real reaction to a world that has decided she is not a person, but a problem to be solved with fire and torture. The book, in its dark pages, held a power far more sinister than any charm or spell, a power to condemn the innocent by twisting the very idea of a troubled mind into a new, horrific form of sin. The dark book and the fear of the witch hunt fade, and you are now in a bustling, grimy city, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and river mud. You are in 16th century London, and you are standing outside the gates of a place that will become infamous for centuries, the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, or, as the masses called it, Bedlam. This is a pretty mainstream historical fact. Bedlam was one of the first and most well-known institutions in Europe to specialize in the care of the mentally ill. Though its early history was more about warehousing than healing, you step through the gates and into a loud, chaotic courtyard. The sound of shouting, wailing, and the rattling of chains is overwhelming. Patients are housed in small, bare cells, often restrained to the walls. The belief here, for the most part, has nothing to do with humors or demons. It's more about a raw, brutal pragmatism. These people are a danger to themselves and society, and they need to be confined. They are a problem to be contained, not a person to be healed. The treatments are rudimentary at best. Purges, beatings, and cold baths were all considered therapeutic. The institution was seen as a kind of human dumping ground, a place to put the mad out of sight and out of mind. A quirky tidbit is that by the 17th century, the hospital became a kind of tourist attraction. For a small fee, the public could come and gawk at the patients, treating their suffering as a form of entertainment. You can almost feel the cold, stony stares of the visitors as they point and laugh at a man who is screaming and pulling at his chains. The sign above the gate says hospital, but it feels more like a zoo. Historians still argue whether the creation of institutions like Bedlam was a step forward or a step back for mental health care. On one hand, it acknowledged that the mentally ill required a special kind of attention and a place to be. On the other hand, it codified a system of brutal neglect and exploitation that would last for centuries. It was a new kind of confinement, one that was both physical and psychological. You watch as a guard pushes a bucket of food through a small slot in a cell door, and you feel the true horror of a place that was supposed to offer care but offered only a new kind of suffering. The name Bedlam would become a synonym for chaos and madness. And for good reason. The chaos of Bedlam and the cruelty of the witch hunts begin to recede, and you feel the intellectual air lighten. The scent of ink and freshly printed paper fills the air, and you're surrounded by the new ideas of the Renaissance. This is an era of rebirth, a time when scholars are rediscovering ancient Greek and Roman texts and, more importantly, are putting a new emphasis on the individual human being. This is a pretty mainstream historical fact. Renaissance humanism shifted the focus from the divine and the demonic to the human, and this had a profound effect on the way people thought about the mind. You find yourself in a quiet study. A man with a gentle face and a quill in his hand is writing. This is Erasmus of Rotterdam, and he's not writing about sin or demons, but about the inward man, the emotional and psychological life of a person. A quirky tidbit is that humanists like Erasmus and the great playwright Shakespeare were fascinated by the complexities of the human mind, from love and jealousy to madness and melancholy. They saw the mind not as a battlefield for good and evil, but as a complex, internal world filled with a mix of passions, thoughts, and emotions. Think about Shakespeare's Hamlet, a character who is famously plagued by a kind of madness that is both real and feigned. His mental state isn't a result of a demon, it's a result of grief, betrayal, and a kind of existential dread. The treatments of this time still relied on the humoral theory, but the focus was on a more holistic approach. A physician might still recommend a change in diet, but they would also recommend a change in art, music, or conversation to soothe the troubled mind. The mind was seen as a kind of garden that needed careful tending. The idea of talk therapy began to emerge, not in a formal sense, but in the belief that a good, long conversation with a wise person could help untangle a person's thoughts and emotions. Historians still argue whether Renaissance humanism was truly a step forward for mental health care. Did it offer a more compassionate and human-centered view of the mind, or did it simply replace the old, spiritual blame with a new kind of individual blame, where a person's mental state was seen as their own responsibility? You watch as the scholar dips his quill in the ink, his face thoughtful. In this new world, a troubled mind wasn't a spiritual failing, but a human one, a flaw in the garden that could, with time and care, be brought back to bloom. The seeds of modern psychology were being sown, not in a laboratory, but in the mind of a single, thoughtful man. The quiet study of the humanist fades, and you are now in a new era. The 17th century. The air is filled with the scent of gunpowder and the hum of new machinery. The focus is no longer just on the soul or the humours, it's on the mechanics of the universe. This is a mainstream historical fact. With the rise of the Age of Reason, a new way of thinking about the mind emerged. The mind was no longer a spiritual entity, but a kind of machine, a complex system of gears and levers that could, like any machine, break down. You are standing in a small laboratory. A man with a stern face and a pocket full of tools is examining a person who has become withdrawn and refuses to speak. He's not looking for a demon or an imbalance of humours, he's looking for a broken part. A quirky tidbit is that this mechanical view led to some bizarre and often horrifying theories about how the brain worked. Some theorists believed that madness was caused by a kind of brain congestion, a blockage of the flow of what they called animal spirits. This invisible fluid was thought to flow through the nerves and power the body. A blockage of these spirits would cause a malfunction, a kind of mental breakdown. The treatments were often aimed at clearing this congestion. You can almost feel the cold dread of a patient being subjected to a kind of crude brain massage or a new form of bloodletting aimed at relieving this imaginary pressure. This new way of thinking was a profound shift. It was a complete separation of the mind from the divine and the supernatural. Madness was not a moral failing or a spiritual crisis. It was a physical problem, a kind of biological breakdown. Historians still argue whether this mechanical view of the mind was a net positive for mental health care. On one hand, it laid the groundwork for modern neuroscience and the idea that the brain is a physical organ that can be studied and understood. On the other hand, it also led to a kind of cold, dehumanizing view of the mentally ill, who were no longer seen as people with a soul, but as broken machines to be fixed. The patient became a specimen, a thing to be poked and prodded in the name of science. You watch as the man with the tools taps on the patient's skull, as if listening for a broken part, and you feel the chilling sense of being reduced from a complex human being to a simple physical puzzle. The gears and levers of the mechanical mind fade, and you are now in a new world, a new century. The air is filled with the scent of perfume and the rustle of silk. You are in 18th century Europe, and a woman, a well-to-do socialite, has suddenly become prone to fainting spells, fits of uncontrollable laughter, and sometimes even temporary paralysis. Her husband calls for a doctor, not to cure a spiritual affliction or a broken brain, but to diagnose a condition that is a pretty mainstream historical fact, hysteria. You watch as the doctor, a man with a serious face and a wig, examines her. He has no fancy machines or spiritual charms. He believes her condition is caused by a problem with her uterus, a kind of wandering womb. A quirky tidbit is that the word hysteria comes from the Greek word hysterika, meaning of the womb. The belief was that the uterus, if it was not satisfied or if it was not in its proper place, could cause all sorts of psychological and physical problems. The treatments were often peculiar. A doctor might prescribe a horseback ride, a cold bath, or even a marriage, all aimed at getting the uterus back where it was supposed to be. It was a bizarre kind of a diagnosis that was almost exclusively leveled at women. The woman is not seen as a machine with a broken part, but as a kind of fragile, emotional being whose mental state is a direct result of her biology. Historians still argue whether the diagnosis of hysteria was a genuine attempt to understand a complex set of symptoms or a convenient way for a patriarchal society to control and dismiss women who did not conform. Was it a way to pathologize female emotion and behavior, or was it a reflection of a real, if poorly understood, set of medical problems? You watch as the doctor prescribes a dose of a strong, floral-smelling sedative, and you feel the weight of a society that has decided that a woman's mental state is a direct result of her gender. The concept of hysteria would haunt medicine for centuries, a ghost of an idea that would continue to shape the way we think about the female mind. The diagnosis of hysteria and the polite parlours of the 18th century are gone, replaced by the grim, soot-stained cities of the early 19th century. The scent of industry and human misery hangs in the air. A new movement is sweeping through Europe, a kind of dark social reckoning. This is a mainstream historical fact, the Great Confinement. As philosopher Michel Foucault would later call it, was a new trend of isolating the mad, the poor, the criminal, and the unemployed in massive, often inhumane, institutions. You find yourself in a large, forbidding stone building. The air is cold and smells of stale food and unwashed bodies. You see a long corridor filled with cells, each one containing a person who has been deemed unfit for society. This is not a hospital in any modern sense of the word. It is a place of discipline and control. The belief is not that these people are sick, but that they are a problem. The cure is not medicine, but containment. They are a danger to themselves and to others, and they must be removed from the public eye. A quirky tidbit is that the logic behind this confinement was a strange mix of fear and economic anxiety. The Industrial Revolution was creating a new kind of social disorder, a large, mobile population of the unemployed and the mentally ill who didn't fit into the old social structures. The solution was to lock them up. The asylums of this era were not just for the insane, they were for anyone who was seen as a threat to the social order. They were a kind of all-purpose human waste bin. Historians still argue whether the Great Confinement was a genuine, if misguided, attempt at social reform or a brutal and dehumanizing way to deal with the problems of a new, industrialized world. Was it a step toward a more compassionate form of care, or was it a form of state-sanctioned torture? You watch as a guard in a simple, dark uniform walks past, his keys jangling on his belt, and you feel the chilling sense of a new kind of institutional oppression. The human rights of the mentally ill, which had never been great, have now been completely stripped away in the name of order. The mad are no longer just outcasts, they are prisoners. The grim walls of the asylum give way to a quieter, more hopeful scene. You are in Paris, in the late 18th century, and the air is charged with the revolutionary fervour of a new idea. A man, a physician named Philippe Pinel, stands in the Salpêtrière Hospital, a massive institution for women. The air is filled with the sound of rattling chains and the smell of human misery. But Pinel is not here to contain the mad, he is here to free them. This is a pretty mainstream historical fact. Pinel is famous for unchaining the patients at the Salpêtrière and Bicêtre hospitals. A radical act of compassion that would change the course of psychiatry forever. You watch as he stands before a patient, a woman who has been chained to a wall for years. She's thin, her eyes are wild, and she's a terrifying sight. But Pinel does not see a beast, he sees a person. He speaks to her quietly, gently, and with a kind of profound respect. He believes that her madness is not a crime to be punished, but an illness to be treated with kindness, dignity, and a good environment. A quirky tidbit is that Pinel did this not out of a sudden humanitarian impulse, but as a kind of scientific experiment. He wanted to prove that kindness and humane treatment were more effective than brutality. He believed that the patient's agitation was a result of their inhumane conditions, not the cause of their madness. The scene is one of quiet, revolutionary drama. Pinel orders the chains to be removed, and the woman is led to a small, clean room with a bed and a window that looks out onto a garden. The other doctors protest, arguing that she will be a danger to herself and to others. But Pinel holds firm. His new method, which would become known as moral treatment, was a profound and radical shift. The goal was to remoralize the patient, to treat them with compassion, and to give them a sense of routine and purpose. The asylums that embraced this new idea became a kind of quiet, rural sanctuary, a far cry from the bedlams of the past. Historians still argue whether Pinel was truly the father of modern psychiatry, or if his reforms were a kind of temporary flicker in a long history of institutional brutality. Did his reforms truly change the way we see the mentally ill, or was it a brief, shining moment of compassion that was soon forgotten? You watch as the woman, free from her chains for the first time in years, stands at the window, a look of profound, almost childlike wonder on her face. The change in her demeanor is almost instantaneous. Her eyes, once wild, are now filled with a kind of quiet hope. The air in the room, once filled with the smell of fear and misery, now feels a little lighter, a little cleaner. The chains of the Parisian asylum are gone, and you find yourself in a different kind of quiet. The air is still and a little mysterious, scented with old wood and pipe smoke. You are in a private meeting room, and the men gathered around a table are all part of a secret society, a kind of brotherhood that values reason, morality, and self-improvement. They are Freemasons. This is a quirky tidbit. While not directly a psychiatric organization, Freemasonry's emphasis on moral and spiritual health during the Age of Enlightenment played an intriguing, if indirect, role in shaping attitudes toward mental well-being. You listen as the men talk not of demons or humors, but of the importance of living a virtuous and rational life. They believe that a man's mental state is a reflection of his moral state. A man who lives a life of order, reason, and self-control, they believe, will have a sound and healthy mind. A man who succumbs to his passions and vices will become, in a sense, a prisoner of his own mind. You hear them discuss the idea of a troubled mind not as an illness, but as a kind of moral or spiritual flaw that can be corrected through discipline and a strong moral compass. The cure is not in a bottle or a bloodletting, but in a life of sober contemplation and brotherly support. This is a mainstream historical fact, the Enlightenment, with its focus on reason and individual responsibility, placed a new kind of pressure on the mind. The ideal was a man who was the master of his own thoughts and emotions, and to fail at this was a kind of social and moral failing. The Freemasons' emphasis on self-improvement and their secretive rituals were a kind of guided therapy for a man's soul. Historians still argue whether these kinds of moral and philosophical approaches to mental health were a step forward or a step back. Was it a form of empowerment, where a person was given the tools to heal themselves, or was it a form of social pressure that led to a new kind of self-loathing for those who could not conform? You watch as the men stand, their faces solemn and serious, and you feel the weight of a new kind of mental burden. The burden of a society that has decided that a sound mind is not a gift from God, but an achievement of man. The quiet brotherhood of the Freemasons fades, and the world grows larger, more institutional. The scent of brick and mortar fills the air as you stand before a new, imposing building. This is a rural asylum in the 19th century, a place that embodies a new kind of social progress. This is a mainstream historical fact, with the moral treatment movement and the Enlightenment's focus on rational care. The construction of public and private asylums for the mentally ill exploded across Europe and America. You walk through a manicured garden, a stark contrast to the grim, urban bedlams of the past. The air is clean, and the patients, some of whom are working in the garden, are treated with a quiet dignity. The idea is that a peaceful, rural environment, combined with a daily routine of work, rest, and simple pleasures, is the key to a troubled mind's recovery. A quirky tidbit is that these new asylums often had their own farms, and the patients were expected to work them. It was believed that physical labor would both restore their humors and give them a sense of purpose. It was a kind of proto-occupational therapy. You can almost feel the smooth handle of a hoe in your hands as you watch a patient methodically tending to a row of vegetables. But not all asylums were created equal. While some, particularly the smaller, private ones, were genuinely humane and focused on treatment, many of the large, public institutions were little more than warehouses for the poor and the inconvenient. The same old problems of overcrowding, understaffing, and inhumane conditions began to creep back in. The reformers, like Pinel, had a beautiful idea. But the reality of a large-scale, state-run system was often a very different, and much darker, story. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of asylums was a net positive for mental health. Did they provide a safe haven for the mentally ill and offer a new, compassionate form of care, or did they just create a new kind of social problem, a new place to hide away society's undesirables? You watch as a physician, a man with a kind face and a weary expression, walks the grounds. He is dedicated to his work, but you can see the weariness in his eyes. He is fighting a battle against overcrowding and a lack of resources, a battle that would come to define the history of these new institutions. The asylum, once a symbol of hope, was already beginning to show its cracks. The quiet, manicured grounds of the asylum give way to a stage, a kind of dramatic show in a parlor. The air is thick with anticipation and the scent of human curiosity. A man with a piercing gaze and a theatrical manner stands before a woman who is trembling with a kind of nervous energy. His name is Franz Mesmer, and he is about to perform a strange new treatment that is a pretty mainstream historical fact, mesmerism, or the belief in animal magnetism. You watch as Mesmer makes a series of dramatic passes over the woman's body with his hands, never touching her, but moving with a kind of hypnotic, flowing motion. He believes that a universal fluid, a kind of animal magnetism, flows through all living things, and that a disruption in this fluid is the cause of nervous ailments and mental distress. His treatment, a kind of guided therapy and trance-like state, is meant to re-establish the proper flow of this invisible fluid. A quirky tidbit is that he even used a large tub of water filled with iron filings. A kind of group therapy session where patients would hold onto a metal rod and wait for the magnetic crisis to happen. The idea was that the more people that were in the tub, the stronger the magnetic field would be. The woman begins to tremble, then to convulse, and finally to fall into a state of deep calm. The crowd watches with a mixture of awe and skepticism. Mesmer is not a physician in the traditional sense. He is a showman, a kind of proto-psychologist who is tapping into the power of the mind itself, though he would have called it a physical force. His work was a profound shift away from the purely physical and back toward the invisible. But this time, the invisible was not a demon, but a kind of cosmic energy. Historians still argue whether Mesmer was a charlatan or a genuine pioneer. Did he discover the power of the placebo effect and the mind-body connection? Or was he a con artist who exploited the public's thirst for a new kind of miracle cure? You watch as the woman, now calm and serene, stands and thanks Mesmer, and you feel the weight of a new and powerful force entering the world of mental health. Suggestion. The mind, it turns out, is not just a brain or a soul, but a powerful and mysterious entity that can, with a little help, heal itself. The theatrical stage of mesmerism fades, and you are now in a serious, quiet laboratory, the air smelling of dust and old paper. The walls are lined with strange plaster busts, each one covered in bumps and ridges. A man, a scholar with a long, serious face, is holding one of these busts, and he's explaining a new, bizarre science that is a pretty mainstream historical fact: phrenology. This theory, developed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, claimed that a person's personality and mental faculties could be determined by the size and shape of their skull. You watch as the man, a follower of the German physician Franz Gall, points to a bump on the bust's forehead. He explains that this bump signifies the area of benevolence. Another bump, behind the ear, is the area of destructiveness. A quirky tidbit is that phrenologists created detailed maps of the human skull, with each area corresponding to a specific mental trait or faculty. They believed that by measuring these bumps, they could get an accurate reading of a person's character, intelligence, and even their propensity for madness. This new pseudoscience was a kind of simplified, accessible psychology for the masses. It was a way for people to understand and categorize human behavior without the need for complex philosophical or medical training. It provided a seemingly scientific explanation for everything from genius to madness. The belief was that the brain, as the organ of the mind, was made up of a series of localized areas, and the size of each area would be reflected in the shape of the skull. A big bump for hope meant a hopeful person. A big bump for secretiveness meant a secretive person. It was a physical, tangible way to understand an invisible, internal world. Historians still argue whether phrenology was a dangerous and deceptive pseudoscience or a genuine, if misguided, step toward modern neuroscience. On one hand, it led to a lot of quackery and exploitation, with phrenologists making a living by reading a person's head for a small fee. On the other hand, it did spark a new interest in the brain as a physical organ and the idea that different parts of the brain might have different functions. It was a wrong answer, but it was a step toward asking the right questions. You watch as the man runs his fingers over the bumps on the bust, his face filled with a quiet, scientific certitude, and you feel the weight of a time when the mind's secrets were believed to be written in the very bones of the head. The bizarre bumps of phrenology fade, and you are now in a new world, a new time. The air is thick with the smell of gas lamps and the sound of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestone streets. You are in Victorian England, a world of strict social conventions, rigid moral codes, and profound social anxiety. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Victorian era's complex societal pressures and moral judgments created a unique environment where the understanding of mental health was deeply intertwined with a person's moral character and social standing. You find yourself in a stuffy, over-decorated parlour. A young woman, a poet with a sensitive nature, has become prone to fits of what her family calls melancholy. She refuses to attend social functions, and she spends her days in a kind of quiet despair. Her family is deeply concerned, not just for her well-being, but for their reputation. A quirky tidbit is that in this era, a diagnosis of mental illness, particularly for a woman, could be a kind of social death sentence. It could ruin a person's chances of marriage and could bring shame to an entire family. The public was obsessed with the idea of nerve and character, and a person's mental state was seen as a reflection of their moral fortitude. The doctor, A man with a serious face and a moralistic tone is called in. He doesn't talk about humours or demons. He talks about nervousness, exhaustion, and a lack of moral fibre. His treatments are often a mix of the physical and the moralistic. He might prescribe a course of hydrotherapy, a kind of cold bath to shock the nerves back into health, but he might also prescribe a course of moral instruction, a kind of sermon on the importance of duty, hard work, and good cheer. The belief was that a troubled mind was a sign of a person's moral weakness, and the cure was not in a pill, but in a change of character. Historians still argue whether the Victorian approach to mental health, with its emphasis on morality and social conformity, was a more compassionate or more dangerous way of understanding the mind. On one hand, it allowed for the idea that mental distress was a real thing that could be treated. On the other hand, it placed a heavy burden of blame on the individual, suggesting that their suffering was their own fault. You watch as the poet sits in her chair, her face a mask of quiet despair, and you feel the weight of a society that has decided that the mind is not just a brain, but a moral battleground where a person must fight for their own sanity. The stuffy Victorian parlour and its moralistic judgments fade, and you are now in a new, more horrifying scene. You're in London, and the year is 1814. You are not a patient, but a curious visitor, and you are here to see one of the city's most peculiar and troubling sights. You are at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, or Bedlam, and it has become a tourist attraction. This is a shocking, yet mainstream historical fact. For a period in the 18th and early 19th centuries, it was common for the public to pay a penny to visit the asylum and gawk at the patients. You step through the gates, a small, copper coin heavy in your hand. The air is filled with the sound of shouting and wailing. You walk down a long corridor, and the cells on either side are filled with people who are suffering from every imaginable form of mental distress. A quirky tidbit is that the most entertaining or amusingly mad patients were often put on display in the most prominent cells, much like a sideshow at a circus. You see a man who is convinced he is the King of England, a woman who sings and dances to an invisible orchestra, and a man who sits in a catatonic state, staring at a blank wall. The visitors, a mix of the well-to-do and the poor, point and laugh, and a few toss small pieces of food or trinkets into the cells. The patients are not seen as people with an illness. They are seen as a spectacle, a form of lowbrow entertainment. Historians still argue whether the public's fascination with asylums was a sign of a society's deep-seated cruelty or a kind of morbid curiosity born of ignorance. Was it a way for people to feel better about their own sanity, or was it a genuine, if misguided, attempt to understand a mysterious and terrifying condition? You stand there, a kind of horrified spectator, and you feel the weight of a society that has decided that the mentally ill have no right to privacy or dignity. The asylum, once a symbol of hope, has become a place of public exploitation. The sign above the gate says hospital, but it feels more like a prison, or perhaps even worse, a zoo. The man who thinks he's a king turns his head and looks at you with a kind of profound, tragic dignity. And for a moment, you feel the shame of the whole century. The horrifying spectacle of the Victorian tourist attraction fades, and you are now in a new world, one where the light of reform is beginning to shine. The scent of disinfectants and clean air fills the institutional halls. A new idea, a new philosophy of care, is taking hold. This is a mainstream historical fact. The moral treatment movement was a push for a more compassionate, humane form of care for the mentally ill, emphasizing a tranquil environment, meaningful work, and a sense of dignity. You find yourself in a new kind of asylum, a rural one, far from the grimy cities. It's not a place of chains and public display, but a place of peace. You see patients tending to a garden, reading in a quiet library, or engaging in a game of checkers. The physician, a man with a kind and gentle demeanour, walks among them, not as a warden, but as a guide. He believes that the human mind, even a troubled one, can be healed through kindness and a good environment. A quirky tidbit is that the movement was heavily influenced by Quakerism, a religious movement that emphasized the inner light and the inherent goodness in all people. This spiritual belief translated into a practical, compassionate approach to care. You can almost feel the gentle breeze as you watch a patient sketching a picture of a bird, a small, fragile act of creation that feels like a powerful antidote to the chaos of the mind. The goal here is not to fix a broken machine, but to re-moralize a person, to help them regain a sense of self and purpose. The treatments are not physical, but psychological and environmental. A patient who is prone to outbursts might be given a quiet room to calm down in, not a straitjacket. A patient who is withdrawn might be encouraged to join in a communal meal or a group activity. The focus is on the individual, on their unique needs and their capacity for recovery. Historians still argue whether the moral treatment movement was a genuine and lasting reform or a brief, idealistic moment that was crushed by the realities of overcrowding and underfunding. Did it offer a new, more compassionate way of seeing the mentally ill? Or was it a new kind of institutional control, one that was just a little prettier than the last? You watch as the physician sits with a patient, talking quietly, and you feel the weight of a new and profound hope. The mind, it seems, can be healed, not with force, but with a gentle hand and a kind heart. The gentle, humane world of the moral treatment movement fades, and you are now in the bustling, smoky cities of the late 19th century. A world of telegraph wires, steam engines, and a new kind of social stress. The air is thick with the nervous energy of the Industrial Revolution. This is a pretty mainstream historical fact. Doctors of this era began to diagnose a new condition, one that was seen as a kind of modern malady, neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion. You find yourself in the office of a well-regarded physician, a man with a thick beard and a serious face. A patient, a wealthy businessman who has become prone to fits of anxiety and a kind of profound, lingering fatigue, is sitting across from him. The physician doesn't talk about demons, humours, or morals. He talks about nerves, about a kind of overstimulation from the relentless pace of modern life. The idea was that the human nervous system was like a battery, and the stresses of modern life, the constant noise, the endless work, the rapid pace of change, were draining that battery. A quirky tidbit is that the cure for neurasthenia was often a rest cure, a period of forced bed rest, isolation, and overfeeding, particularly for women. The idea was to restore the nervous energy that had been drained away by the demands of a modern world. For men, the treatment was often a West cure, a rugged vacation in the mountains or on the frontier to restore their masculine vigor. You can almost feel the stifling boredom of the rest cure, the long, lonely days spent in a quiet room, or the exhausting physical exertion of the West cure, a kind of forced outdoor therapy. Historians still argue whether the diagnosis of neurasthenia was a legitimate medical condition or a cultural symptom of the anxieties of a new, industrialized world. Was it a way for a society to give a name to a new kind of stress and burnout? Or was it a convenient way to pathologize a person's inability to keep up with the demands of an increasingly unforgiving social and economic system? You watch as the physician writes a prescription for a period of forced rest and a kind of moralistic sermon on the importance of self-control. The mind, it seems, has now become a kind of fragile, nervous machine that can be worn out by the very world it lives in. The nervous energy of neurasthenia fades, and you are now in a new, quieter world, the world of the psychiatric hospital. The air is sterile and smells faintly of antiseptic. You are in the early 20th century, and the field of psychiatry is beginning to coalesce into a new, more formalized science. This is a mainstream historical fact. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the emergence of the first wave of modern psychiatrists. Men and women who were trying to understand the mind not just through moral or social lenses, but through a new, more scientific one. You find yourself in a large lecture hall, listening to a group of serious-faced men and women debating the causes of mental illness. They talk about heredity, environment, and, for the first time in a serious way, the brain's anatomy. But their methods, their treatments, are often a strange mix of the old and the new. You see a physician in a small, stark room, administering a dose of insulin to a patient, inducing a kind of artificial coma. This is insulin shock therapy, a bizarre and dangerous procedure that was believed to reset the brain. A quirky tidbit is that doctors also used hydrotherapy, a kind of forced, high-pressure water massage, which was supposed to calm the patient's nerves. The asylum of this era was a kind of scientific playground, a place for doctors to experiment with new and often brutal treatments. Historians still argue whether the early days of modern psychiatry, with its focus on scientific treatments, were a step forward or a step back. On one hand, it moved away from the moralistic judgments of the past and toward a new, more clinical view of the mind. On the other hand, it often replaced the old cruelty with a new, more scientific cruelty, one that was just as dehumanizing and often more dangerous. You watch as a patient, a young woman who has become catatonic, is led to a room for a hydro treatment, and you feel the chilling sense of a science that has not yet learned the meaning of compassion. The asylum of this era was a place of both great promise and profound horror. The antiseptic-scented halls of the early 20th century asylum fade, and you are now in a new world, a new time, and a new idea is about to take hold. The air is filled with a sense of intellectual rebellion, a new kind of social and psychological questioning. You are in Vienna, and a man with a thick beard and a quiet intensity is at the center of it all. His name is Sigmund Freud, and his new theory, psychoanalysis, is about to turn the world of psychiatry on its head. This is a pretty mainstream historical fact. Freud's ideas, which emphasized the unconscious mind and the importance of childhood trauma, were a radical departure from the purely biological and moralistic explanations of the past. You find yourself in a quiet room, sitting on a comfortable couch. You're not being asked about your diet or your moral character. You're being asked to talk, to free associate, to tell stories about your dreams and your childhood. A quirky tidbit is that Freud believed that the mind was like an iceberg, with a small, visible part on top, the conscious mind, and a massive, unseen part underneath, the unconscious. He believed that the secrets and traumas of your past were hidden in this unconscious mind, and that they were the root cause of your mental distress. His treatment was a kind of archaeological dig into the human psyche, a journey into the past to uncover the hidden truths that were causing the problems of the present. His ideas were a profound and, for some, a deeply unsettling shift. He suggested that your parents, your dreams, and your sexual desires were the real cause of your problems, not a broken brain or a lack of moral fortitude. He saw the mind as a complex system of drives, desires, and defenses, a world of internal conflict. His work was both a form of therapy and a new way of seeing the human condition itself. Historians still argue whether Freud's theories were a genuine scientific breakthrough or a brilliant, but ultimately unprovable, work of fiction. Did he truly unlock the secrets of the unconscious mind, or did he simply create a new, compelling narrative for human suffering? You lie on the couch, the quiet stillness of the room broken only by the sound of Freud's voice, and you feel the weight of a new and profound idea, that the path to a healthy mind lies not in a physical treatment, but in a long, difficult conversation with yourself. The quiet psychoanalytic couch fades, and you are now in a new, more horrifying world. The air is sterile, and the silence is punctuated by the low hum of machinery. You are in the mid-20th century, and a new, more drastic approach to mental health is taking hold. This is a mainstream historical fact. In the 1940s and 50s, a new surgical procedure, the lobotomy, was introduced as a treatment for a wide range of mental illnesses, from schizophrenia to anxiety. You watch as a surgeon, a man with a steady hand and a kind of terrible scientific certitude, stands over a patient. The procedure is shockingly simple. A small tool, an ice pick-like instrument, is inserted through the eye socket and into the brain, and with a quick, decisive sweep, the surgeon severs the neural connections in the frontal lobe. A quirky tidbit is that the procedure was performed in a matter of minutes and often without anesthesia. The belief was that by severing these connections, the doctor could cure the patient of their mental distress, their anxiety, and their aggression. The patient would be calmer, quieter, and easier to manage. The results were often a kind of terrible, quiet tragedy. The patient would survive, but they would often lose their personality, their emotions, and their capacity for complex thought. They would become a kind of ghost of their former self. The lobotomy was a chilling embodiment of the mechanical view of the mind, the idea that the brain was a machine that could be fixed by simply removing a broken part. Historians still argue whether the lobotomy was a genuine attempt to help patients or a brutal and unforgivable act of scientific hubris. Did it offer a last, desperate hope for people who were suffering from debilitating mental illness? Or was it a new kind of social control, a way to make the inconvenient and the difficult compliant and quiet? You watch as the patient, once a vibrant and complex human being, is wheeled away, their eyes vacant and their face a blank mask. The asylum of this era, once a place of hope and reform, has now become a place of profound and irreversible horror. The mind, it seems, can be broken, not with a blow, but with a simple, quiet surgery. The quiet horror of the lobotomy fades, and you are now in a new world, a new time. The air is thick with the scent of fear and judgment. You're in the mid-20th century, and a new kind of social problem is taking hold, the stigma of the madhouse. This is a mainstream historical fact. A diagnosis and institutionalization were not just a medical event, they were a social one, a kind of permanent scarlet letter that could follow a person for the rest of their lives. You find yourself in a small, quiet town. A family has sent their daughter, a young woman who has become prone to fits of mania and profound sadness, to the asylum. The house is silent now, but the silence is filled with a kind of profound, unspoken shame. The neighbours whisper behind their hands, the friends stop calling. The family, once a part of the vibrant social fabric of the town, is now a kind of social pariah. A quirky tidbit is that the term loony bin or nut house became a common part of the vernacular, a way for society to distance itself from the problem of mental illness. The mentally ill were not just sick, they were crazy, a term that was used to dehumanize and dismiss them. The stigma was a kind of psychological prison, a new and terrible form of confinement. Even after a person was cured and returned home, the shadow of the asylum would follow them. They were seen as damaged, unreliable, and potentially dangerous. The social consequences of a mental illness were often as devastating as the illness itself. Historians still argue whether the stigma of the asylum was a genuine reflection of a society's fear of the unknown or a deliberate tool of social control. Was it a way for society to enforce conformity by punishing those who stepped outside the norms? Or was it a simple, human reaction to a terrifying and poorly understood condition? You watch as the family sits at their dinner table, the empty chair at the end a quiet, powerful symbol of a new kind of loneliness and a new kind of social exile. The mind, it seems, can be broken, not just by an illness, but by the very society it lives in. The quiet shame of the madhouse fades, and you are now in a new world, a new time. The air is filled with the sound of jazz, the rustle of flapper dresses, and the rebellious spirit of the roaring 20s. This is a mainstream historical fact. The 1920s saw a significant shift in attitudes toward mental health, moving away from the Victorian moralism and toward a new kind of popular psychology. The mind was no longer just a place of sin and shame, it was a kind of a playground, a source of new and exciting discoveries. You find yourself in a bustling salon, a new book, The Meaning of a Dream, in your hand. The book, a popular interpretation of Freud's ideas, is a sensation. People are talking about their dreams, their subconscious desires, and their repressed memories. A quirky tidbit is that the idea of the psychological drama became a kind of cultural obsession. People were no longer just sick, they were psychologically interesting. Mental health was becoming a kind of status symbol, a topic for dinner parties and intellectual salons. It was a kind of highbrow entertainment, a way for people to feel like they were part of a new, enlightened class. The idea of the talking cure was also gaining traction. People were going to psychoanalysts to talk about their problems, not just to be medicated or contained. The focus was on the internal world, on the self, on the idea that a person's problems were a result of their own psychological makeup, not a sign of moral failing or a biological defect. Historians still argue whether the popularization of psychology in the 1920s was a genuine step toward mental health awareness or a kind of narcissistic trend. Did it truly help people, or did it simply create a new kind of psychological jargon that was used to justify social anxieties and a new kind of self-obsession? You watch as a woman, with a new, short haircut and a long string of pearls, explains her latest dream to a captivated crowd. The mind, it seems, is no longer a prison, but a new and exciting frontier for a generation that is determined to leave the past behind. The jazz-fueled intellectualism of the roaring 20s fades, and a new, more somber scene takes its place. The air is thick with the scent of fear and the low, constant rumble of distant cannons. You are in a hospital in the trenches of World War I, and a new, terrifying mental health crisis is beginning to unfold. This is a mainstream historical fact. The psychological trauma of war, which was once dismissed as cowardice or a lack of moral character, was now being recognized as a legitimate medical condition. A phenomenon called shell shock, a precursor to our modern understanding of PTSD. You watch as a young soldier, his eyes wide and unfocused, trembles in his bed. He is not physically wounded, but he is unable to speak, and he flinches at every loud noise. The doctors, baffled, have no name for his condition, but they know it is real. A quirky tidbit is that the term shell shock came from the belief that the soldier's nervous system was physically damaged by the vibrations of exploding shells. It was a kind of new, mechanical explanation for a psychological problem, a way for a society to understand a trauma that it had never seen before. The treatments were often a strange mix of the old and the new. A doctor might try a kind of talk therapy, but they might also try electroshock therapy, a kind of brutal attempt to jolt the soldier's nerves back into place. The war was a kind of social and psychological crucible that forced the world to confront the reality of mental trauma. The soldier who returned home from the war was no longer just a hero. He was a person who had been profoundly changed by his experiences, and society had to find a new way to understand and help him. Historians still argue whether the recognition of shell shock was a true step forward for mental health awareness. Did it finally give a name to a profound and debilitating condition? Or did it just provide a new kind of excuse for a society that was unwilling to confront the horrors of war? You watch as the soldier is given a strong sedative and drifts off into a troubled sleep, and you feel the weight of a new kind of human suffering, a suffering that is not of the body, but of the mind. The haunted memory of shell shock and the war-torn landscape fade, and you are now in a new world, a new time. The air is filled with a sense of quiet, scientific progress. You are in the mid-20th century, and a new kind of medicine is about to change the face of psychiatry forever. This is a mainstream historical fact. The discovery and development of psychotropic drugs, medications that affect the mind, marked a revolutionary turning point in the treatment of mental illness. You find yourself in a sterile laboratory. A scientist in a white coat is poring over a microscope. He's not looking for a demon or a faulty moral compass. He's looking for a chemical. A quirky tidbit is that the first major breakthrough, the antipsychotic drug chlorpromazine, once called thorazine, was actually discovered by accident. It was being researched as an antihistamine, but researchers noticed that it had a profound calming effect on patients in psychiatric wards. It was a complete game changer. For the first time, a doctor had a tool that could directly affect the brain's chemistry. This was followed by the discovery of early antidepressants, which were first developed to treat tuberculosis but were also found to have a mood-lifting effect. The asylum of this era, which had once been filled with the sounds of screaming and the sight of physical restraints, was now a little quieter. The patients, once agitated and violent, were now calm and manageable. This new medicine was not a cure, not in the sense of a magical potion, but it was a kind of chemical key that could unlock a person's mind and allow them to live a more normal life. The physical and psychological treatments of the past, the lobotomies, the shock therapies, the moral judgments, were not erased, but they were now seen as a last resort, a sign of a more primitive time. Historians still argue whether the advent of psychotropic drugs was a net positive for mental health. On one hand, it allowed millions of people to leave the asylum and live a more normal life. It gave hope to families and a new kind of freedom to patients. On the other hand, it also led to a new kind of social problem. It led to the idea that all mental illness was a simple chemical imbalance that could be solved with a pill, and it sometimes led to a kind of over-medication that left patients feeling numb and disconnected from the world. You watch as a physician hands a small pill to a patient, and you feel the weight of a new and profound hope that the mind's darkest secrets might not be spiritual or moral, but chemical, and that they might, just might, be treatable. The quiet, scientific revolution of psychotropic drugs fades, and you are now in a new world, a new time. The air is filled with a sense of social upheaval and a new kind of social conscience. You are in the mid-20th century, and a new movement is about to change the face of psychiatry forever. This is a mainstream historical fact. The community mental health movement was a push to close the large, inhumane asylums and to integrate mental health care into the community. It was a kind of new social experiment, a way to dismantle the old, oppressive institutions and to create a new, more humane system of care. You find yourself in a small, local clinic, not a grand, imposing institution. The air is clean and the walls are brightly painted. A person who has been discharged from a state hospital is meeting with a social worker. The goal here is not to confine the person, but to help them reintegrate into society. They are given a small apartment, a job, and a network of support services. A quirky tidbit is that the movement was heavily influenced by the rise of psychotropic drugs. With the new medications, it was no longer necessary to keep patients in a locked ward. They could be managed in the community, and they could live a more normal life. The asylum, which had been a kind of permanent prison, was now seen as a temporary place, a place to stabilize a person before they could return home. The movement was a radical and, for many, a deeply liberating idea. It was a complete rejection of the Great Confinement, a new kind of social contract with the mentally ill, but it was not without its problems. The funding for the community clinics was often inadequate, and many of the people who were discharged from the asylums were left to fend for themselves on the streets. The deinstitutionalization was often a kind of social abandonment, a new kind of cruelty disguised as a new kind of freedom. Historians still argue whether the community mental health movement was a genuine and lasting reform or a new kind of social failure. Did it truly help to dismantle the old, oppressive institutions, or did it just create a new kind of homeless population, a new kind of social problem that no one wanted to talk about? You watch as the social worker talks to the person about their new life, their new freedom, and you feel the weight of a new and profound question: is it better to be locked up and cared for, or to be free and alone? The promise of community mental health fades, and you are now in a new world, a new time, and the air is filled with the scent of rebellion and social change. You are in the 1960s, and a new movement is taking hold, a kind of psychological counterculture. This is a mainstream historical fact. The anti-psychiatry movement was a radical school of thought that questioned the very idea of mental illness, arguing that it was not a disease to be cured, but a natural, and sometimes even a healthy, human response to a sick and oppressive society. You find yourself in a university lecture hall. A man with a wild look in his eyes is at the podium. He's not a traditional psychiatrist, he's a philosopher and a social critic. He argues that mental illness, particularly schizophrenia, is not a biological disorder, but a kind of existential protest against the demands of a conformist society. He believes that the mad are not sick, but are, in a sense, a kind of prophet, a person who has seen through the illusions of a society and has chosen to live in their own truth. A quirky tidbit is that some of the most famous thinkers of this movement, like R.D. Laing, were not just talking about theory, they were creating alternative communities where people with mental illness were allowed to live and explore their madness without being medicated or confined. These were places of radical freedom, where a person's strange behavior was not pathologized, but celebrated. The movement was a profound and deeply unsettling shift. It was a complete rejection of the medical model of mental illness. The idea that the mind was just a broken brain that could be fixed with a pill or a surgery. It was a return to the idea that the mind and the person were one, and that a person's problems were not a sign of a disease, but a sign of a kind of social and spiritual malaise. Historians still argue whether the anti-psychiatry movement was a genuine and humanistic step forward or a dangerous and irresponsible trend that left the truly sick and suffering without the care they needed. Did it help to humanize the mentally ill and to dismantle the old, oppressive institutions, or did it just replace a brutal medical model with a kind of philosophical neglect? You watch as the man at the podium, his voice filled with passion, speaks of the wisdom of madness, and you feel the weight of a new and profound question. Is it possible that the cure for a troubled mind lies not in a pill or a lobotomy, but in a new kind of society? The radical ideas of the anti-psychiatry movement fade, and you are now in a new world, a new time. The air is filled with the low hum of a computer, and the light from a screen illuminates your face. You are in the late 20th century, and a new way of thinking is taking hold, a new kind of social and psychological lens. This is a mainstream historical fact. Postmodern perspectives began to see mental distress not as a simple disease with a single cause, but as a complex phenomenon, a natural human experience, or a social construct. You find yourself in a university classroom. The professor at the front of the room is talking about the mind, not as a machine, but as a kind of narrative. They argue that mental illness is not a universal truth, but a story we tell ourselves about a set of behaviors. A quirky tidbit is that this new way of thinking led to a new kind of therapy called narrative therapy, where the therapist helps the patient to re-author their own story, to see their problems not as a part of their identity, but as a separate, external force. The goal is not to cure the patient, but to help them find a new, more empowering way to talk about their own life. The professor talks about the idea of social constructs, about how a society's definition of normal and mad is not a fixed truth, but a kind of shifting, historical agreement. They argue that the madness of the past was often a kind of social deviance, a person who was not a danger to themselves or others, but a danger to the social order. They are not talking about a simple medical cause and effect. They are talking about a complex web of social, political, and cultural forces that shape a person's life and their mind. Historians still argue whether the postmodern perspective on mental health was a genuine and humanistic step forward or a new, and sometimes confusing, form of intellectual relativism. Did it help to humanize the mentally ill and to dismantle the old, rigid categories of diagnosis? Or did it make it harder for people to get the care they needed by denying the existence of a real, biological problem? You sit in the classroom, the words of the professor swirling in your head, and you feel the weight of a new and profound question. Is your mind a biological truth, or is it a story you tell yourself? The abstract ideas of the postmodern classroom fade, and you are now in a new world, a new time, one that feels both incredibly vast and incredibly small. The air is filled with a low, electronic hum. You are in the 21st century, and a new kind of social and psychological paradox is taking hold. This is a mainstream historical fact. The rise of the internet and social media has created a profound and strange new environment for mental health, one that offers unprecedented connection, but also a new kind of isolation. You are sitting alone in your room, the glow of your phone illuminating your face on the screen. You see a stream of curated, perfect lives, smiling faces, exotic vacations, and a constant flow of happy updates. You are connected to thousands of people, but you feel completely alone. You can send a message to a friend on the other side of the world, but you can also feel the subtle sting of social comparison, the constant pressure to present a perfect, edited version of yourself. A quirky tidbit is that the term FOMO, or fear of missing out, which is a kind of modern anxiety, has become a common part of the vernacular. It's a new kind of social anxiety that is born of a world where you are constantly being reminded of all the fun you are not having. The internet has also created a new kind of therapy. You can join online support groups, talk to a therapist through a video call, and get information about a new kind of therapy, all from the comfort of your own home. But it has also created a new kind of problem. The constant stream of information, the endless notifications, and the pressure to be always on can lead to a new kind of mental exhaustion. The mind, it seems, can be broken not just by a chemical imbalance, but by a new kind of digital overwhelm. Historians still argue whether the internet is a net positive for mental health. Did it help to humanize the mentally ill and to dismantle the old social stigmas by creating a new kind of community? Or did it just create a new and more pervasive kind of social anxiety and isolation? You put your phone down and sit in the quiet darkness of your room, and you feel the weight of a new and profound paradox. You are more connected than ever, but you have never felt so alone. The blue glow of the screen and the digital noise of the internet fade, and you are now in a new world, a new time, and a new idea is beginning to take hold. The air is filled with the scent of lavender and the quiet hum of a meditation app. You are in the 21st century, and a new kind of social and psychological trend is taking hold. This is a pretty mainstream historical fact. The rise of the mindfulness and wellness movement is a new, and for many, a deeply liberating, approach to mental health. You find yourself in a quiet room, sitting on a soft mat. You're not being asked to talk about your childhood or your humors. You're being asked to breathe, to focus on the present moment, to simply be. A quirky tidbit is that this new movement is a strange and beautiful mix of ancient spiritual traditions, like Buddhist meditation and modern psychology. The idea is that the mind is not a broken machine or a battlefield, but a kind of wild, untamed garden that can be cultivated with a little attention and care. The treatments are not medications or surgeries, but practices, meditation, yoga, journaling, and a kind of quiet, daily self-care. The goal is not to cure a person, but to help them find a new, more peaceful relationship with their own mind. The movement is a kind of rebellion against the constant noise and overstimulation of the modern world. It is a push to turn off the phones, to quiet the endless stream of information, and to simply be present. It is a new and powerful form of self-help, a way for people to take control of their own mental well-being without the need for a professional or a pill. Historians still argue whether the wellness movement is a genuine and lasting reform or a kind of narcissistic trend that is only accessible to the wealthy and the privileged. Did it help to humanize the mentally ill and to dismantle the old social stigmas by creating a new, more accessible kind of care? Or did it just create a new kind of pressure, a new and exhausting expectation to be happy and well at all times? You sit on the mat, your eyes closed, and you feel the weight of a new and profound question. Is your mental health a problem to be solved, or a garden to be tended? The soft glow of the meditation app fades, and you are now in a new world, a new time, and a new kind of scientific revolution is taking hold. The air is filled with the low, steady hum of an MRI machine, and the scent of human curiosity. You are in the 21st century, and a new way of thinking about the mind is emerging, one that is grounded in a new, more profound understanding of the physical brain. This is a mainstream historical fact. The latest neuroscience is showing us that the brain is a malleable organ, and that mental health is a complex dance between biology, environment, and experience. You find yourself in a lab. A neuroscientist in a white coat is looking at a high-resolution image of a human brain on a large screen. The image is not a static map like the phrenologists imagined, but a vibrant, constantly changing network of neural connections. The scientist is talking about neuroplasticity, the idea that the brain is not a fixed organ but a dynamic one, that it can change and rewire itself in response to experience, thought, and emotion. A quirky tidbit is that they are also talking about the gut-brain axis, the idea that your mental health is not just a matter of your brain, but is also deeply connected to the health of your digestive system. It's a return to the old, holistic ideas of the past, but with a new, scientific understanding. The scientist is not talking about demons or humors. They are talking about neurotransmitters, gene expression, and the complex, beautiful, and sometimes tragic ways that a person's life can be reflected in the physical structure of their brain. The treatments of this new era are not just pills or surgeries. They are also new kinds of therapy that are aimed at rewiring the brain, at creating new neural pathways, at helping a person to literally change their own mind. Historians still argue whether the new era of neuroscience is a genuine step toward a more effective and compassionate form of mental health care or a new kind of biological determinism. Did it help to humanize the mentally ill by showing that their problems are real, physical things that can be understood and treated? Or did it create a new kind of pressure, a new and exhausting expectation to optimize your own brain? You watch as the scientist points to a small, brightly colored part of the brain on the screen, and you feel the weight of a new and profound question. Is your mind a fixed thing, a product of your genes, or is it a kind of beautiful, ongoing, and mysterious creation? The vibrant image of the brain on the screen fades, and you are now in a new world, one that is not of the past but of the present and the future. The air is filled with a sense of quiet hope and a new kind of social awareness. You are in the 21st century, and the long, strange journey of mental health history is coming to an end. At least for tonight, you are here, in this moment, a living embodiment of this history. This is a mainstream historical fact. We are living in a time of unprecedented mental health awareness and a new kind of collective understanding. The mind is no longer a spiritual battlefield, a broken machine, or a social disgrace. It is a complex, beautiful, and sometimes fragile part of the human experience. You see a young person talking to their friend about their anxiety, not in whispers, but in the open. You see a public service announcement on a bus, urging people to seek help. You see a therapist on a popular podcast, talking about the importance of self-care. The stigma is not gone, not entirely, but it has been chipped away, brick, by a new generation that is more open, more honest, and more willing to talk about the things that were once unmentionable. A quirky tidbit is that the rise of social media, for all its flaws, has also created a new kind of public forum for mental health, a place where people can share their stories, find a community of support, and talk about their struggles without shame. The internet, which once created a new kind of social anxiety, is now also a place of healing. The treatments of this new era are a strange and beautiful mix of the past and the future. We have the medications that were discovered in the last century, but we also have the talking therapies that were pioneered by Freud and the moral treatment of Pinel. We have the new, scientific understanding of the brain, but we also have the ancient, spiritual traditions of meditation and mindfulness. We are not choosing one over the other, we are taking them all and creating a new kind of holistic, humanistic approach to care. Historians still argue whether this new era is truly a step forward, or if it's just a new kind of passing trend. Are we truly more enlightened than our ancestors? Or are we just telling ourselves a new, more comforting story about a problem that is as old as humanity itself? You sit in the quiet of your room, the echoes of the last 44 sections of history swirling in your head, and you feel the weight of a new and profound question. What does it mean to be a whole person? A person of body, mind, and soul, in a world that is so full of chaos and so full of hope? The journey, it seems, is not over. It is only just beginning. The distant sounds of the city, the hum of the refrigerator, and the soft beat of your own heart begin to fade. The images of the past, the kings, the shamans, the doctors, and the fools, all begin to recede. Like a tide going out, you are not a spectator anymore, but a person of mind and body, of dreams and desires. The journey of the mind, from the spiritual to the scientific, is not a history lesson, but a part of your own life, a part of the air you breathe, the worries of tomorrow, the thoughts of yesterday. They are just whispers in the quiet of the night. Let them go. The mind is a vast and beautiful thing. Let it rest. The only thing that matters now is the quiet, and the breath, and the sweet comfort of sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.